Good evening, I am Amadin Ogbewe. Now tonight we'll be taking a look at corruption, particularly anti-corruption education. Now while anti-corruption is popular and deals with implementation of enforcement and punitive measures to correct corruption and corruptive practices, we have anti-corruption education being a sort of preventive measures where citizens, government and all other stakeholders are brought in and educated on what it means to have values and morals and ethics in a system that might attempt to corrupt these individuals and people and practices. This is something that is fairly new in the issue of anti-corruption, where an alternative means has been considered to teach people so they don't do, rather than punishing them after they do. I've been joined tonight by the program director for Step Up Nigeria, an anti-corruption education body, Mr. Samuel Asimi. He joins me now to do justice to the matter. He tells me what the challenges are for anti-corruption education in Nigeria, the progresses made, the way forward, and everything to expect in the issue of anti-corruption and the various ways we can deal with the menace of corruption. All right, Mr. Samuel Asimi, it's good to have you on Talk.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, like I said, we're talking about anti-corruption and also anti-corruption education. But let's start with the main issue first. For those who don't know, what is anti-corruption really?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of an overview, to enable human existence, we try to set laws, policies and framework to definitely control how we behave and how we interact. And in doing that, we also tend to appoint some certain persons into some certain positions. So we submit our powers to them to lead us. And when these individuals abuse the powers of entrusted onto them for their own personal gain, that is corruption in itself. So corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. So it can happen in different forms, different areas, no matter how small to how big. As small as maybe a class rep in some schools and some institutions abusing their power, that's also corruption. So anti-corruption is trying to be against corruption, trying to tackle it, and trying to ensure that as humans, we actually coexist, ensuring that corruption is actually reduced to its barest minimum.
All right, that's fair enough. Now, let's talk about the education. You know, I know you are championing that cause right now. When you say education, what do you mean? What are you trying to tell people about it? Because people see anti-corruption as EFCC, ICPC. So when you're educating the average person, they're wondering, what's their business in this?
No, and it's very important we've actually gotten into education because generally in anti-corruption we have two approaches to tackle corruption. It's the generally accepted point. So the first, you have sanctions and enforcement. So that's the EFCC, the ICPC, the Code of Conduct Bureau, the police. More like, of course, sanctioning them in line with the laid-down laws, arresting the faulters, putting them in jail after due process. So that's the sanction and enforcement. Then the education part is actually a very new aspect of anti-corruption, which is coming up. And there we're actually looking at social norms, behavioral changes, collective action. It's new and it's not new, and I would explain. It's new in the sense that it's been mainstreamed into the anti-corruption discourse because it's something we all need to do very well. It's not new in the sense that these are the practices we actually had growing up in our homes, where you take something that doesn't belong to you from the school to your house, and your mom the next day marches you to the school with that pencil, telling your teacher that she didn't buy this for you. So whoever owns it should actually come and pick it up, and of course being properly sanctioned at home and in school. So that's building that social consciousness amongst citizens, amongst Nigerians. And we think it's important because generally, when you look at the challenge we have in tackling corruption, we also have the people, right, who need to put pressure on the different law enforcement officials. We have the people who need to ensure that the anti-corruption institutions perform as they should. We have the people who need to ensure that elected officials carry out themselves in a way and manner that's actually acceptable. So we are building that consciousness amongst not just the citizens, but also the political office holders, but more so for the citizens, to build that collective action in them. I'll give you a very classic example. If a political office holder comes around and the request, right? So this person is supposed to make law, for example, a lawmaker. When he comes, say, to the village and people go asking him for 1,000 naira, 5,000 naira, 10,000 naira, asking him for a bag of rice, asking him for wrappers and the rest. If you look at his main basic take-home pay, he won't be able to satisfy those needs. I think that's very important. But however, due to the pressure, we've had cases where some elders in a community just call a political appointee and tell him that the house he's staying is not befitting for their son of that status, that he needs 2 or 3 story buildings. I've had that clear scenario. They told this member that his house, they don't have a story building in that clan, and they need him to actually erect one, looking at his position there. So once you make that request, then definitely you're pushing that lawmaker to start looking for means to actually meet that demand or meet that request. So these are the education we're trying to, this is what we're trying to do, to enlighten citizens so they understand that they can also contribute to it. Now that's on one hand. On the other hand, it's not like we're absolving, and I think it's very, very important, the politicians or these public office holders of the blame. No, they hold a big chunk of it. But then as citizens, we can also put them in order. Say things like vote trading, right? Vote buying and the rest. You rejecting those things, instead telling them, instead of buying the votes, show us the roads. Show us the hospitals you've built, right? Show us the schools you've built. So coming from that angle, we feel it's also very important to complement it. So generally, the position generally is that the sanctions and the education approach should go hand in hand in tackling corruption. So definitely there are those deviants who wouldn't follow the norms, who wouldn't follow the collective majority. So once those deviants, those minority exhibit those attitudes, then they can actually be sanctioned appropriately. But using just sanction as a tool, we feel that wouldn't really help because it's expensive. It takes time, very, very, very long. I would give you an example. In 2016, the Chief Judge of Oyo State, he was making a comment and he said, an address, and he said it takes 22 years for a case to move from the magistrate up onto the Supreme Court for it to be addressed. So that's 22 years. You ask yourself, what's the life expectancy of the average Nigerian? Somewhere in the early 50s, right? So you spend about over a third of your life just looking at a court case progress that way. So instead of just having that, instead of clogging the legal system, we can start with those sanctions approach, the education approach, and ensure we educate citizens across all levels. All right. Yeah.
All right, that's fair. You know, when you describe anti-corruption education, it sounds sort of like teaching value systems, you know.
Absolutely.
So to speak. Well, when you mentioned, you know, the lawmakers or politicians visiting home and getting demand, it reminded me of 2 particular examples recently. 2 new lawmakers, I believe they were House of Reps members. One of them went to a school and demanded a teaching job, where he says he wants to be able to teach while his other duties. I remember another lawmaker in Delta State who was videoed in his farm with his fishes. And he said, because I won an election doesn't mean I will not do my work. You know, so I guess these are some of the things that people should look out for. But that being said, on the issue of values, how big a target or big a mission do you think that is? Because every other day Nigerians are talking that, you know, the system is so and so. Very recently now, taking into account recent developments across our bordering countries, people are saying that is military rule so bad? We're going to have discipline, we're going to this and that. That for in a democracy, we can't possibly have values and discipline and do things right. So this skill, the task of the mission you have to accomplish, how does it, make you feel really?
So it's so first of all, we acknowledge that it's a long-term thing, and that's where one of the cons of it compared to the sanctions approach, right? So sometimes arrests could be made immediately, but for values orientation and reorientation, ensuring that citizens learn and unlearn some things, it takes time. But then at the end, you would see the benefits, because at the end, citizens would. They won't be doing it just because there's a lawmaker or there's a law enforcer waiting for them. They'll be doing it because they believe in it, because they know collectively that action they are taking will definitely improve the country. So that's why they'll be doing it. So we'll change the value system, teach them about those things, and then see the country move forward. Like you rightly mentioned, we've been seeing lots of military takeover in the last 2-3 years. We've had about 6, right, across the Sahel, the belt of the Sahel. Now, it's disturbing and clearly points to lots of public office holders, democratically elected, who are not delivering on the dividends of democracy they actually promised during the campaigns. And you can see citizens not being happy. But then in general, the military takeover is not the way to go, because after a couple of months, years, that realization would set in, and would see changes would definitely need to also come in place. I think for Mali had already said they would have their elections next year, because lots of these things are not sustainable. But general, for equal representation, of course, democracy is the way to go. But in general, public office holders need to deliver. Once they don't, then you have all those takeover. And a key way to do that is actually ensuring the value system. When we collectively sanction them, when we talk about this, it could also be a punishment, like a tool to punish public office holders, right? Once they come with questionable resources, not even just public office holders, right? Different fraudsters, irrespective of their occupational obligations, once they come, instead of giving them titles, right, communities ask them more like lifestyle audits, more like social audits, right? Get them to explain what they do, why, how, and get them to be transparent to the society. So once we have that at the homes, at our social stratas down there in the communities, that would actually definitely help collectively to deal with lots of the issues we are facing. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I think there's a word for that. Is it social correction or thereabouts? But basically, it's people doing it themselves without the law having to come into it. Well, I want to ask a question that might be considered controversial. What's the part of religion in all of this? There's culture, but then there's also religion, and it moves a lot of people. Particularly with a section of religion, we're seeing there's an increase in a certain type of teaching these days, which is the teaching of prosperity. Some people will say that you need wealth to raise the name of God, or so to speak, and so on and so forth. And like you said, where people are meant to question wealth that they don't know came about, these days, if you come with wealth into a religious house and you make a sizable donation, questions are not asked as much. Now, the question really is that, what is the link between a religion and Nigeria being close to the poverty capital of the world? Do you think that factor, that because we just don't have enough wealth in the country, has made wealth become almost a religion of its own?
You're absolutely right. Religion has a key. It's actually a key factor, right? It's a personal belief. Individuals have rights to practice the religions and they want to practice, but it's also influenced lots of things, and in the space or in our engagements, there are lots of things the government can do for you that you don't need to pray for. I think that's very important. So the roads are bad, right? The government can fix the roads. So you don't have to pray for, of course you pray for Johnny Messes, right? That's fine. But then the government should fix the roads, right? You don't have to pray for employment. Once you go to school, the government provides those jobs. The jobs will be there, right? If you move from Abuja to Kaduna, you don't have to then pray before security, right? Definitely you need to pray, but then the government should also play its part, right? The government should ensure those roads are secured. So generally, the religious entities from different divides need to ensure that they also come on board. Lots of them are doing it already, but we need to see them doing more. Value teaching, reorientation on ethics, on integrity, on all these issues, because it's very, very important that that's done, because they are actually very influential. Religion is actually very, very influential in the current Nigerian setup across the length and breadth of the country. It's something lots of Nigerians hold very dear, and once religious leaders across divides can actually imbibe this, it will really go a long way, because even these political actors, these political exposed persons and these public office holders belong to one of these religions for political interests, right? So if these houses inform these political office holders of what they need to do and get their followers as well to ensure that, then would actually be better. But as a whole, generally, I think it's very important that the religious houses also lend their voice to discourse to ensure that the country gets better, because things are not really good. You don't need a preacher to make that obvious, right? We just had the NLC protest. We have fuel prices being very high. We had the president just barely 48 hours ago talking about some group of people who are very strong, who took over the subsidy and the rest, and there's a need to ensure names are mentioned. There's a need to ensure these persons actually face the full wrath of the law. They can't hold the country hostage and not be dealt with lawfully. So these are the issues, but generally it's important that the religious actors also come on board.
That's fair enough. I'd like to get more expansion on when you mention the strata or the different levels that need this education. Talking about formal education now, is it all the way from primary, secondary, and all that? But before that, I'd like to get for a particular demography, which is adults, like people who are already perhaps fully formed or have fully formed opinions. Do you get any pushback? You mentioned, you gave the instance of constituents wanting something from their rep. There's a saying, I believe in, I think it's a Nigerian, part of Nigerian parlance, which is, where man they walk, then they chop. So people believe that wherever you are, you have the ability, or you have the license to do whatever you can to get extra, to make more, to cut corners, because that's where you work, and so on and so forth. So do you get that pushback? And let me give an instance. There is a popular lawmaker, or a lawmaker who is popular on social media, and he has constantly reiterated that the electorate is part of the problem. He says that if electioneering wasn't so expensive, then perhaps elected officials wouldn't feel the need to steal as much, take as much to recuperate what they spent. That after spending about ₦1 billion trying to get into office, that it doesn't make sense to expect that person not to steal more billions. So they put the blame and so on. But then the electorate, they say, these people, they don't listen to us, they don't talk to us. Once they win, they are gone. So we must collect now. So that pushback, do you encounter it? And if you do, how do you convince them?
We do encounter that pushback, and it's a vicious circle, because someone gets some funds, campaigns, wins, gets in, enriches himself, comes back again. The circle continues, right? Now, the challenge with that is, no matter what that public politician gives each citizens, it's barely enough, right? It's 5,000. That's 10 liters of fuel. It's not even up to 10 liters of fuel in today's world, right? You want to take that for 4 years? That wouldn't. So this is the message you give them back, right? We had the states where they had elections and just 2-3 onion bulbs, sachet of vegetable oil, and salt were packaged in a very, very small, tiny souvenirs and shared, distributed to individuals. That won't even help them, a family, to just eat a day, right? And that's gone. As against that, why not reject those things? And this is how we try to explain to individuals, right? Because if you collect that, you won't have the conscience to come before this political office holder to tell him you need X, Y, Z, because he will tell you you've collected his money, so you don't have the right to speak. But once you reject that, you can actually speak and tell him. And the saying about the workshop, the work where he works, we have that very well. Now every person they work in the shop. Now why they call them workshop, right? So we get those sayings, but then if you look at it very, very practically, you can't work in every facet or everywhere, right? So you're just working just where you work. But in carrying out your daily lives, you need to also interact with other work areas of different people.
True.
So if you in your own office, you're saying you need to eat, bear in mind that it's a system. If everyone in the system is saying they want to eat, then it's going to be a mess, because the roads will be bad, you won't have security, you won't have employment, you won't have healthcare. The country will just be in comatose. So that's the message you try to pass, right? Just do your best. Ensure you live right. Ensure you do what is expected of us as individuals. Because at the end of it all, we don't have another country. Nigeria is our country that we call our own. So this is the message. But yes, to answer your questions, we do experience pushback very well. But we'll just discuss with them. As against this, demand for this. And we've had a couple of engagements in Nasarawa where we've seen that happen. There was a transformer that was fixed for a certain community, where after they rejected getting the money, right? So they told the public office holder they don't want money. They have issues in the community, and those funds were part of. We have zonal intervention projects and the rest, right? So that was done for them. And I think that's the way to go, where people reject individual benefits, right? And fight rather for the collective interest. That's the message we give Nigerians very well. You can do better collectively, right? You can't do your own way out of bad governance. It needs to be a collective issue. If your house is very nice, if you are comfortable in your own place, your neighbor is not comfortable. So when we hear the poor would eat the rich, or we hear lines like that, that's what we are talking about. Because when you think you're comfortable, but you pass a bad road, right, you're not secured. It will definitely still affect you, irrespective of how it's done. So it's better we try our best to be accountable. That's
fair enough. Now let's talk about the other demographies, the younger ones. You know, what's that like, trying to educate young persons? Is it something that should be done through the schools, or through, you know, like I said before, religious teachers, or from the home? What's it like? What's that? Is there a difference? Because like the people I mentioned are adults, so definitely they have more fully formed opinions than younger ones. Do you find it easier to talk to these ones, and what's working in that regard?
So you're all right. The younger ones have not formed opinions. You can actually discuss with them. They're actually very open. They tell you how it is. I've got cases of young kids going for their class captain election, and then trying to bribe 1 or 2 persons with sweets. We've actually had kids reporting their mates, and in that scenario, the school had to tell that child not to go for it, and we educated the child that was not the way to go. So that's a bit free and something they can actually engage. But generally also, in addition to that, for those who are almost adults, or those who would soon be adults, I'm talking about teenagers, there's also the challenge of social vices, right? You have advanced fee fraud individuals, popularly known as Yahoo boys and, of course, girls. You find them influencing this category of young people. And that's a challenge, right? Because how do you explain to a young person that you should go to school and read your books, when he's seeing graduates, those who have graduated, not having jobs, and these individuals who go into fraud are sort of living the life. So we try our possible best to ensure that we educate them, make them understand these things are short-lived. In the more long term, what is sustainable is for these young people to definitely follow what the law says, be law abiding, try their best, put in their best, and definitely they'll be rewarded. So for that demographic, it's a bit easier than the adults because they are also being catered for by adults. So they've not really seen real life issues. So it's very easy to inform their minds on these things than the adults.
Okay, that's fair enough. It's what I say, inspiring to know that the younger ones are being carried along. So let's talk about, where, first of all, let me put the question straight. Is there any, what I say, country, government that doesn't have some level of corruption? I ask this because people believe that it is only here. You see them saying, we're in Nigeria, that's why this and so on. So the question is there corruption in other governments? If there is, why does it seem as though their corruption or the corruption of developed countries, does it hinder their development? But it seems to be the main problem, or perhaps the biggest issue that we have over here. So
now we'll go into a little bit of the theories around corruption. So different countries, like you mentioned, no country exists without corruption. We just have different levels. And that's going by different measurements, depending on what methodology you use and what you measure for. That's very important. Even researchers will tell you, once they are ranking a country on XYZ index, they have their methodology. You can look at the methodology and you understand what was done and what was used. Across the world, we have different countries, and countries are in different stages. And we have different forms of corruption. So lots of petty corruption, you won't really see them in developed countries. I think that's very important. So what you see are really grand schemes of corruption, different levels of state capture, different forms of nepotism, favoritism coming up. In societies where you have grand corruption, they try their best, some societies, like developed societies. So petty corruption is dealt with, right? So things like healthcare, you can get healthcare. Things like education, you can get education. Things like good roads, those basic amenities are there. So that's why it's not as pronounced as it is. But then you still have lots of dealings in terms of, if you go into procurement in these countries, you see lots of issues. But here, why it's very, very loud is we don't have basic amenities. So you have a combination of both the petty and both the grand corruption. The grand corruption in the sense that the political office holders are diverting and laundering funds. Then the petty corruption in the sense that you have the police officer at the checkpoint still telling the citizen to pay XYZ amount. You have the medical personnel telling you need to pay this for your card. The petrol attendants telling you need to pay some money for him to put some petrol in your jerry can or somewhere. You have this at petty levels, and then it becomes very bad because at different levels where citizens go to, they face extortion. They are being told to pay some level of funds. So then it seems very pronounced. And we are the most populated country in Africa, Nigeria as a whole. So definitely expect the outcry or the effect of these things to be pronounced because we have the numbers, we have the population. So just in responding to your question, we also have other countries who have corruption. It's not just in Nigeria. It's just the type of corruption and the level of corruption that they have. That's where those challenges come in. But generally, it's that way. So things like tax evasion, money laundering, things like tax havens, we have lots of them, right? Those developed countries are tax havens. Switzerland, London, Qatar, and the rest, they are all tax havens. So different levels and different issues being faced.
All right, that's fair enough. Just to round up now, what would you really want the public and people to know as regards anti-corruption education, and it being a viable means of perhaps even preventing or forestalling some of these things from happening to the point where we now need heavy enforcement and heavy punitive measures to correct?
I think basically what citizens need to understand is to know that citizens have power to change lots of things. Working collectively as citizens, citizens coming together to take action against corruption is very, very important. It's crucial. If that's done, it will go a very long way to solve the challenge of corruption. Our citizens need to ensure that they work against corruption, actively work against corruption. That's very important. And in our homes, in our little places, as little as that little action we think doesn't matter, it really does when you aggregate all those actions together. You see the issue and you see the challenge it brings to the society. So generally, as citizens, we're actually expected to ensure that we conform ourselves. We also speak against bad behavior. Very, very important. We speak against bad behavior. We act against bad behavior. And then we ensure that collectively as a society, we work with one another to respect the laws of the land.
All right, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure hearing from you. And it's good to always hear about these alternative measures that is not just about punishing or, waiting till it gets very bad. So thank you so much for all you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.